Marcus stood perfectly still at his post, his polished armor gleaming under the afternoon sun. The royal plaza buzzed with its usual activity as merchants sold their goods and children played near the fountain. He had been guarding the palace entrance for 3 years now, and every day felt the same. The weight of his sword hung familiar at his side, and his eyes automatically scanned the crowd for any signs of trouble. The plaza was busier than usual today. A festival was planned for tomorrow, and vendors were setting up colorful stalls everywhere. Marcus watched a group of acrobats practicing their routine near the center fountain. Their bright costumes caught the light as they flipped and spun through the air. He allowed himself a small smile, remembering when he used to watch such performances as a child in his village. A messenger boy rushed past him carrying a stack of royal announcements. The boy's face was red from running and sweat dripped from his forehead. Marcus nodded at him as he passed. The boy was new to the palace staff, probably no more than 14 years old. Marcus remembered being that young and eager once before life taught him to be more careful about everything. The afternoon heat made his armor uncomfortable, but Marcus never complained. His father had taught him that a real man endures hardship without whining. His father had been a blacksmith with hands rough from years of working with hot metal and heavy hammers. He always told Marcus that strength came from doing your job well, no matter how difficult it became. A group of noble ladies walked by, their silk dresses rustling softly in the breeze. They laughed at something one of them said, their voices light and musical. Marcus kept his eyes forward, but he could smell their expensive perfume as they passed. It reminded him of the flowers his mother used to grow in their small garden behind their house. The palace bells chimed 3 times, marking the middle of the afternoon. Marcus shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other. His legs were starting to feel stiff from standing in the same position for so long. He had learned to make these small movements without anyone noticing. A good guard never showed weakness or discomfort while on duty. Captain Reynolds walked by during his routine inspection. He was a stern man with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He gave Marcus a quick nod of approval before continuing on his way. Marcus felt proud of that small acknowledgement. Captain Reynolds rarely showed approval, so even a simple nod meant something important. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the plaza started to get even more crowded. People were finishing their work for the day and coming out to enjoy the cool evening air. Street musicians began setting up their instruments near the main walkway. Soon the plaza would be filled with music and laughter. Marcus noticed a man in a dark cloak watching the palace from across the plaza. The man had been there for almost an hour, just standing and staring. Something about him made Marcus feel uneasy. His hand moved slightly toward his sword handle, but he forced himself to remain calm. Many people came to look at the palace. Most of them were just curious visitors with no harmful intentions. The man in the cloak finally moved away, disappearing into the crowd. Marcus relaxed slightly, but he made a mental note to mention it in his evening report. Captain Reynolds always said it was better to report something unnecessary than to miss something important. That lesson had saved lives before. A cool breeze began to blow across the plaza, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the street. Marcus's stomach rumbled quietly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since early morning. His shift would end in 2 more hours, and then he could finally sit down and have a proper meal. The acrobats finished their practice and began packing up their equipment. One of them, a young woman with long, dark hair, waved at Marcus as she walked by. He touched his hand to his helmet in a small salute, which made her smile. These small interactions with ordinary people reminded him why he chose to become a guard in the first place. As evening approached, torches were lit around the plaza. The warm light flickered and danced, creating moving shadows on the cobblestones. Marcus had always found this time of day peaceful. The business of the day was winding down, and people seemed more relaxed and friendly. A group of children ran past, chasing a small dog that had escaped from its owner. They laughed and shouted as they ran, their voices echoing off the palace walls. Marcus watched them with fondness, thinking of his younger sister back in his home village. She would be about the same age as these children now. The palace windows began glowing with candlelight as servants lit the lamps inside. Soon the royal family would be sitting down for their evening meal. Marcus wondered what it would be like to eat such fancy food every day. His own meals were simple but satisfying: bread, cheese, soup, and sometimes meat on special occasions. Little did Marcus know that in just a few minutes, his quiet, predictable life was about to change forever. The peaceful evening he was enjoying would soon be shattered by chaos and confusion. His training and instincts were about to be tested in ways he never imagined possible. The first sign of trouble was so small that Marcus almost missed it. A pigeon suddenly flew up from the rooftop across the plaza, startled by something. Then another bird took flight, and another. Within seconds, a whole flock was circling overhead, their wings beating frantically against the evening sky. Marcus frowned and looked more carefully at the building where the birds had come from. It was an old inn with wooden shutters and a red tile roof. Nothing seemed wrong at first glance, but his instincts told him something was different. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, the way it always did when danger was near. A horse whinnied loudly from somewhere behind the inn. Then came the sound of running footsteps, fast and urgent. Marcus straightened up and placed his hand firmly on his sword handle. His pulse quickened as he tried to figure out what was happening. The crowd in the plaza continued their evening activities, completely unaware that anything might be wrong. A merchant was still calling out prices for his vegetables. Two old men sat on a bench sharing stories about their younger days. Children continued playing their games near the fountain. Marcus spotted movement in the shadows between two buildings. Dark figures were moving quickly through the narrow alley that led to the back of the palace. He counted at least 6 men, maybe more. They wore black clothes and moved with the careful steps of people trying not to be seen. His heart began beating faster. This was not normal. Honest people didn't sneak around in the shadows near the royal palace. Marcus looked around for Captain Reynolds or any of the other guards, but he couldn't see them anywhere. He was alone at his post, and something dangerous was definitely happening. The men in black emerged from the alley and spread out around the edges of the plaza. They tried to blend in with the crowd, but Marcus had trained eyes. He could see how they kept their heads down and their hands hidden under their cloaks. He could see how they positioned themselves at different points around the square. Marcus's mind raced through his training. Should he sound the alarm immediately? Should he wait to see what they were planning? Should he try to get closer and gather more information? Every choice seemed dangerous, but doing nothing was definitely wrong. One of the men looked directly at Marcus, and their eyes met for a brief moment. The man's face was scarred and cruel, with cold eyes that showed no mercy. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This was not some petty thief or common criminal. This man was a killer, and he was here for a very serious purpose. The scarred man made a subtle hand signal to his companions. Marcus couldn't tell exactly what it meant, but he knew it wasn't good. The other men began moving slowly toward the center of the plaza, getting closer to the main path that led to the palace entrance. Marcus realized with horror that these men were positioning themselves for an attack. They were planning to strike when someone important came out of the palace or when someone important tried to go in. His duty was clear now. He had to warn everyone and protect the palace no matter what happened to him. But before Marcus could move or shout a warning, everything exploded into chaos. A group of 20 armed men on horseback suddenly charged into the plaza from 3 different directions. Their horses' hooves thundered against the cobblestones like rolling thunder. They wore masks over their faces and carried sharp swords that gleamed in the torchlight. The peaceful evening crowd scattered in terror. People screamed and ran in every direction, trying to find safety wherever they could. A fruit vendor's cart overturned, sending apples and oranges rolling everywhere. An old woman fell down trying to run, and a young man stopped to help her up. Marcus drew his sword and stepped forward, even though he was completely outnumbered. His training took over and all his fear disappeared. He had sworn an oath to protect the palace and everyone in it. That oath was more important than his own life. The lead horseman rode straight toward Marcus, his sword raised high above his head. Marcus could see the man's eyes through the holes in his mask. They were filled with hatred and determination. The horse was massive, with wild eyes and foam around its mouth from running so hard. Marcus planted his feet firmly and raised his own sword to meet the attack. He had practiced this move thousands of times during training, but this was the first time his life actually depended on getting it right. Time seemed to slow down as the horseman approached. The clash of metal against metal rang out across the plaza like a bell. Marcus managed to deflect the first strike, but the force of it nearly knocked him off his feet. The horse reared up on its back legs, and Marcus had to dodge quickly to avoid being trampled by its heavy hooves. More attackers were flooding into the plaza now. Some were on foot, others on horseback. They were shouting orders to each other in a language Marcus didn't recognize. Their plan was clearly well organized. This was not a random attack, but a carefully planned assault on the royal palace. Marcus fought desperately against two attackers at once. His sword moved in quick, precise strikes that his father would have been proud of. But he knew he couldn't hold them off for very long. There were simply too many of them, and they kept coming from all directions. Just when Marcus thought he might be overwhelmed, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the palace alarm bells beginning to ring. Someone inside had seen the attack and was warning everyone. Help would be coming soon, if Marcus could just survive long enough for it to arrive. The palace alarm bells clanged desperately through the evening air, their deep bronze voices calling out the ancient warning that had not been heard for over 20 years. Marcus felt a surge of hope as he heard them, but he had no time to celebrate. 3 more attackers were rushing toward him, their weapons glinting in the flickering torchlight. Marcus spun around and managed to wound one of the attackers in the arm, causing the man to drop his sword with a cry of pain. But another attacker came at him from behind, and Marcus barely managed to duck under a vicious swing that would have taken his head off. His armor caught the edge of the blade, sending sparks flying through the air. Across the plaza, innocent people were still running and screaming, trying to escape the sudden violence that had erupted in their peaceful evening. A mother clutched her small daughter to her chest as she ran toward the safety of a nearby building. An elderly baker stumbled and fell, his fresh loaves of bread scattering across the cobblestones. The attack was spreading beyond the plaza now. Marcus could hear fighting in the streets that led to the palace, and he could see smoke beginning to rise from buildings in the distance. These attackers had not come just to fight one guard. They had come to take over the entire area around the royal palace. Captain Reynolds suddenly appeared at Marcus's side, his own sword already bloody from fighting. His gray hair was wild and his face was grim, but his eyes blazed with the fire of a true warrior. Behind him came 6 more palace guards, their armor clanking as they ran to join the battle. "Hold the line!" Captain Reynolds shouted over the noise of clashing swords and screaming horses. "Don't let any of them reach the palace doors." He immediately engaged 2 attackers at once, his blade moving with the skill and experience of 30 years of fighting. Marcus felt stronger knowing he wasn't alone anymore. He fought with renewed energy, his sword finding its targets with deadly precision. The training he had received every day for 3 years was finally being put to the ultimate test, and he was not failing. But the attackers kept coming. For everyone they defeated, 2 more seemed to appear. Marcus began to realize that this was a much larger assault than he had first thought. These weren't just bandits or rebels. This was an organized army, and they had obviously been planning this attack for months. One of the masked attackers got close enough to Marcus to speak to him directly. "Surrender now, boy," the man growled through his mask, "and we might let you live to see the sunrise." His voice was rough and cruel, like gravel being ground under a boot. Marcus responded by driving his sword deep into the man's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a nearby fruit stand. "The only thing I surrender is your life to the gods," Marcus replied grimly, pulling his sword free and preparing for the next attack. The battle was creating chaos throughout the entire plaza. Overturned carts and scattered goods made the footing treacherous. Broken pottery crunched under everyone's feet, and spilled wine made the cobblestones slippery and dangerous. The beautiful fountain in the center of the plaza was now stained red with blood. Marcus noticed that some of the attackers were carrying strange devices he had never seen before. They looked like metal tubes with wooden handles, and they made loud popping sounds when the attackers pointed them at the guards. Whatever these devices were, they seemed to be weapons of some kind, and they were very effective. Captain Reynolds saw the strange weapons too. "Fall back to the palace steps," he ordered his men. "We need the high ground." The guards began fighting their way backward, step by step, toward the safety of the palace entrance where they could defend more effectively. As they retreated, Marcus got a better view of the entire battle. The attackers had taken control of most of the plaza, but they hadn't been able to break through the main line of palace defenses. More guards were arriving from inside the palace, and some of them were carrying bows and crossbows. Arrows began flying from the palace windows and rooftops, striking down attackers who had gotten too close to the building. The archers were skilled and accurate, and their arrows found their marks even in the dim evening light. Marcus felt proud of his fellow guards and their deadly precision, but the attackers were not giving up easily. Their leader, a tall man with a black beard and cruel eyes, was shouting orders and rallying his troops for another assault. He pointed his sword directly at the palace entrance and bellowed something in that strange language Marcus couldn't understand. Marcus realized that this battle was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning. The attackers had obviously expected some resistance, and they had come prepared for a long fight. They had brought enough men and weapons to lay siege to the entire palace if necessary. The sounds of battle were now mixing with other sounds that chilled Marcus to the bone. In the distance, he could hear the screaming of horses, the crashing of breaking glass, and the crackling of fires that were spreading through the city. This attack was not limited to the palace. It was an assault on the entire kingdom. Marcus gripped his sword tighter and prepared for the next wave of attackers. Whatever these people wanted, whatever they were trying to accomplish, they would have to go through him first. He had sworn an oath to protect this place and these people, and he would keep that oath even if it cost him everything. The wailing of sirens suddenly cut through the noise of battle like knives through cloth. Marcus had never heard such a sound before. It was high-pitched and urgent, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed designed to strike fear into everyone who heard it. The sound came from the palace itself, from somewhere deep inside the ancient stone walls. Captain Reynolds' face went pale when he heard the sirens. Marcus had never seen his commander look so worried, not even in the middle of this deadly battle. "The royal family," Captain Reynolds whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos around them. "They're moving the royal family to the safe chambers." Marcus felt his heart sink. The royal family only went to the safe chambers when the palace was in immediate danger of falling to enemies. Those chambers were deep underground, behind walls of solid rock and steel doors that could withstand almost any attack. If the sirens were calling for that level of protection, it meant the situation was even worse than Marcus had thought. The strange sirens seemed to have an effect on the attackers too. They stopped their advance for a moment, looking around uncertainly as the eerie sound echoed off the buildings around the plaza. Their leader shouted something angry at them in his foreign language, trying to get them to continue their assault. But Marcus could see doubt creeping into some of their faces. Whatever they had been told about this attack, they probably hadn't expected to hear those particular sirens. Those sounds meant that they were now fighting not just palace guards but the entire royal defense system. More guards were pouring out of the palace now, but these were not ordinary guards like Marcus. These men wore different armor, black and silver instead of the usual gold and blue. They carried weapons Marcus had never seen before, and they moved with the deadly confidence of elite warriors. "The Shadow Guard," Captain Reynolds breathed in amazement. "I haven't seen them deployed in 15 years. Marcus had heard stories about the Shadow Guard, but he had always thought they were just legends. These were the king's personal protectors, trained from childhood in the most deadly fighting techniques known to man. The Shadow Guard spread out across the plaza with military precision. They didn't charge into battle like regular soldiers. Instead, they moved like ghosts, appearing behind attackers and striking before their enemies even knew they were there. Marcus watched in fascination as they worked, their black armor making them almost invisible in the evening shadows. The tide of battle began to turn. The attackers who had seemed so confident just minutes before were now falling back under the pressure of these new defenders. Their leader was still shouting orders, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Even he seemed surprised by the appearance of the Shadow Guard. Marcus found himself fighting alongside one of these elite warriors, a woman whose movements were so fluid and graceful that she seemed to be dancing rather than fighting. She never said a word to him, but she nodded respectfully when she saw how well he handled his sword. The attackers were regrouping near the fountain, trying to form a defensive position from which they could continue their assault. But Marcus could see that their organization was breaking down. Some of them were looking toward the streets that led away from the plaza, as if they were thinking about retreating. That's when Marcus heard the sound that changed everything, the deep, rumbling horn that came from the highest tower of the palace. It was a sound he had never heard before, but he knew immediately what it meant. Every guard in the kingdom knew that sound from their training, even though it hadn't been used in living memory. "The king's call," Captain Reynolds said grimly. "He's summoning every loyal soldier in the kingdom to defend the palace." The horn sounded 3 times, its deep voice carrying for miles in every direction. Soon, every guard post and army garrison within a day's ride would be marching toward the palace. The attackers heard the horn too, and Marcus could see panic beginning to spread through their ranks. Whatever their plan had been, it obviously hadn't accounted for the full royal defense being activated. They had probably hoped to complete their mission quickly and escape before reinforcements could arrive. But now they were trapped in the plaza, surrounded by professional soldiers and elite guards with more help arriving every minute. Their leader was still trying to maintain order, but Marcus could see that some of his men were already thinking about how to get out of this situation alive. The strange devices the attackers had been using were running out of whatever power made them work. Marcus had noticed that they made fewer of those popping sounds now, and some of the attackers had thrown them aside and drawn regular swords instead. Whatever advantage those weapons had given them was fading fast. Marcus pressed forward with renewed confidence. He could feel that victory was within reach, though the cost had been high. Several of his fellow guards lay wounded or dead around the plaza, and many innocent civilians had been hurt in the attack. The beautiful plaza that had been so peaceful just an hour ago was now a battlefield covered with debris and blood. The sirens were still wailing from inside the palace, but their tone seemed different now, less urgent, more controlled. Marcus hoped that meant the royal family was safely secured in the underground chambers. Whatever these attackers had been trying to accomplish, they would not succeed in harming the people Marcus had sworn to protect. As the shadow guards tightened their circle around the remaining attackers, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. On the rooftop of a building across the plaza, he could see more figures moving in the shadows. The attack wasn't over yet. It was just beginning a new phase. Marcus tried to shout a warning to Captain Reynolds, but his voice was lost in the noise of battle and sirens. He could only watch in horror as the figures on the rooftop began to reveal what looked like larger versions of those strange tube weapons. Whatever was about to happen next, Marcus knew it was going to be even more dangerous than what they had already faced. Marcus desperately waved his sword above his head, trying to get Captain Reynolds' attention. The figures on the rooftop were now clearly visible, and they were aiming their large tube weapons directly at the palace entrance where most of the guards were gathered. Marcus knew that whatever those weapons could do, it would be devastating at close range. Finally, Captain Reynolds saw Marcus pointing and looked up toward the rooftop. His experienced eyes immediately understood the danger, and he began shouting orders to his men. "Take cover! Rooftop assault! Everyone behind the stone barriers!" The shadow guards reacted instantly to the warning. They scattered across the plaza, using overturned carts and broken walls as shields. Their black armor helped them blend into the shadows, making them harder targets for the attackers above. Marcus dove behind a large piece of fallen masonry, just as the first blast came from the rooftop. The explosion was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard or felt. It was louder than thunder, brighter than lightning, and it shook the ground so hard that his teeth rattled in his head. Where the blast hit, cobblestones were torn up and hurled through the air like deadly missiles. Marcus peeked around his cover and saw that a huge hole had been blown in the plaza's surface. The beautiful fountain that had stood there for centuries was now nothing but scattered pieces of stone and twisted metal. Water from the broken pipes was beginning to flood the area, mixing with the dust and debris. More blasts came from the rooftop, each one creating destruction wherever it hit. The attackers up there were trying to clear a path through the defenders, making it easier for their companions on the ground to reach the palace. Marcus could see their strategy now. They planned to attack from above and below at the same time. But the shadow guards were not easy to defeat, even with these terrible new weapons. Marcus watched in amazement as several of them began climbing the walls of nearby buildings, moving like spiders up the rough stone surfaces. They were going after the rooftop attackers directly, even though it meant exposing themselves to those devastating blasts. One of the shadow guards reached the rooftop and engaged the attackers in hand-to-hand combat. Marcus could see the silhouettes fighting against the evening sky, their weapons clashing in deadly combat high above the plaza. The large tube weapons were useless at close range, giving the shadow guard a fighting chance. Meanwhile, the attackers on the ground were taking advantage of the distraction to make another push toward the palace entrance. Their leader, the tall man with the black beard, was rallying them for what looked like a final desperate assault. They knew that reinforcements would arrive soon, and this might be their last chance to accomplish whatever they had come here to do. Marcus left his cover and joined the defense of the palace steps. His armor was dented and his sword was stained with blood, but his determination was stronger than ever. These attackers had brought terror and destruction to his peaceful city, and they had threatened the royal family he had sworn to protect. The battle on the steps was fierce and brutal. Marcus found himself fighting next to guards he had trained with, men he had shared meals with, soldiers who were like brothers to him. Together they formed a living wall of steel and courage that the attackers could not break through. Captain Reynolds was everywhere at once, encouraging his men and directing their defense. Despite his age, he fought with the skill and energy of a man half his years. Marcus saw him single-handedly defeat 3 attackers who had almost broken through the line on the left side of the steps. Above them, the battle on the rooftop was reaching its climax. Marcus could hear the sounds of combat even over the noise of the fighting around him. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash as one of the large tube weapons fell from the roof and smashed into pieces on the cobblestones below. Cheer went up from the defenders as they realized that the shadow guards were winning the fight on the rooftop. Without those terrible weapons raining destruction from above, the battle became much more even. The attackers on the ground were now fighting without the support they had been counting on. Marcus pressed forward with renewed energy, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks like a farmer's scythe through grain. He had found his rhythm in the battle, and every movement felt natural and right. His 3 years of daily training had prepared him for this moment, and he was not going to waste it. The leader of the attackers was retreating now, calling for his remaining men to fall back toward the streets that led away from the plaza. But the shadow guards had anticipated this move, and Marcus could see dark figures blocking the escape routes. The attackers were trapped, surrounded by professional soldiers with no way out. Some of the attackers threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. They had finally realized that their mission had failed, and they were more interested in staying alive than in dying for whatever cause had brought them here. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction as he saw them give up, but the leader was not ready to surrender. The tall man with the black beard drew a curved sword that gleamed with strange patterns in the torchlight. He looked directly at Marcus and began walking toward him, his eyes filled with hatred and determination. Marcus knew that this was going to be the most important fight of his life. This man was clearly a skilled warrior and a dangerous enemy. Everything Marcus had learned, everything he had trained for, would be tested in the next few minutes. The sirens from the palace were beginning to fade, which Marcus hoped meant that the immediate danger to the royal family was passing. But his own danger was just beginning as the enemy leader approached, his strange sword ready for what would surely be a fight to the death. The enemy leader moved toward Marcus with the confident stride of a man who had killed many opponents in single combat. His curved sword was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The metal seemed to shimmer and change color in the flickering torchlight, and strange symbols were carved along its length. Marcus steadied himself and raised his own sword. His weapon was simpler but well-made, forged by skilled craftsmen in the royal armories. It had served him well throughout this long battle, and he trusted it to serve him well in this final confrontation. The 2 men began circling each other slowly, each studying the other's stance and looking for weaknesses. Marcus could see that his opponent was older and more experienced, but also that the long battle had tired him. There were small cuts on his arms and his breathing was slightly labored. "You fight well for such a young pup," the enemy leader said in heavily accented words. "But tonight you die and tomorrow your precious kingdom falls to my master." His voice was filled with contempt and certainty, as if Marcus's defeat was already decided. Marcus didn't waste energy on words. He had been taught that talking during a fight was a sign of weakness, a way of trying to intimidate opponents instead of defeating them with skill. He kept his eyes focused on the man's sword hand, watching for the first sign of attack. The enemy leader struck first, his curved blade whistling through the air in a complex pattern that Marcus barely managed to block. The force of the blow was tremendous, and Marcus felt his arms shake from the impact. This man was incredibly strong, even after fighting for so long. Marcus responded with a series of quick thrusts and cuts, trying to find an opening in his opponent's defense. But the enemy leader was skilled at reading attacks, and he deflected every strike with minimal effort. His curved sword seemed to flow like water, always in the right position to block or counter. Around them, The battle was winding down as the last of the attackers either surrendered or fell to the swords of the palace guards. But Marcus couldn't pay attention to anything except the deadly dance he was engaged in with this dangerous opponent. The enemy leader suddenly changed his tactics, switching from defensive moves to an aggressive assault. His sword became a blur of motion, striking from angles that shouldn't have been possible with a normal weapon. Marcus found himself being pushed backward, barely able to keep up with the speed of the attacks. Marcus's foot slipped on some of the debris scattered across the plaza, and he stumbled slightly. The enemy leader immediately took advantage of this momentary weakness, lunging forward with a strike aimed at Marcus's heart. Only a desperate sideways roll saved Marcus from being run through by that strange glimmering blade. As Marcus rolled away, he grabbed a handful of dust and small stones from the broken plaza surface. When he came back to his feet, he threw this debris directly into his opponent's eyes. It was not the most honorable fighting technique. But Marcus was fighting for his life and the safety of everyone in the palace. The enemy leader cursed and staggered backward, temporarily blinded by the dust and stones. Marcus seized this opportunity to launch his own aggressive assault, his sword moving in the precise patterns he had practiced thousands of times during his training. For the first time in the fight, Marcus managed to land a solid hit. His blade caught the enemy leader on the shoulder, cutting through the man's leather armor and drawing blood. The wound wasn't fatal, but it proved that this supposedly invincible opponent could be hurt. The enemy leader's eyes cleared, and he looked down at his wounded shoulder with surprise and anger. No one had managed to wound him in years, and this young guard's success filled him with rage. He let out a roar of fury and attacked with renewed ferocity. But anger made him careless. His strikes became wild and uncontrolled, full of power but lacking the precision that had made him so dangerous before. Marcus was able to avoid the worst of these attacks while looking for another opening to exploit. Marcus found his chance when the enemy leader overextended himself during a particularly vicious swing. The curved sword whistled past Marcus's head, but the force of the missed strike left the man briefly off balance. Marcus stepped inside his opponent's guard and drove his sword deep into the man's side. The enemy leader's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He looked down at Marcus's sword protruding from his ribs, then back up at Marcus's face. For a moment, the hatred in his eyes was replaced by something that might have been respect. "You fight well, young guard," he gasped, blood beginning to foam on his lips. "But this is not the end. My master will send others." His legs gave out and he collapsed to the cobblestones, his strange sword clattering away into the darkness. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent, breathing heavily from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around him, the plaza was finally quiet except for the moans of wounded men and the crackling of small fires. The battle was over, but at a terrible cost. Captain Reynolds approached Marcus, his own armor dented and bloody, but his eyes bright with pride. "Well done, Marcus," he said simply. "You fought like a true guardian of the realm." Coming from Captain Reynolds, this was the highest praise Marcus could imagine receiving. But even as Marcus felt pride in his victory, he couldn't forget the enemy leader's final words. This attack had been defeated, but it was apparently part of some larger plan. Someone called Master was behind all of this, and he would probably try again. Marcus looked around at the destruction in the plaza and wondered what other challenges lay ahead. Tonight had tested him in ways he never imagined, but he had a feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous adventure. The first light of dawn began to creep across the plaza as Marcus stood among the wreckage of what had been a peaceful evening just hours before. The beautiful cobblestones were cracked and stained. Broken pieces of the ancient fountain lay scattered everywhere, and the smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. Medical attendants moved carefully through the plaza, tending to wounded guards and checking on the condition of captured attackers. Marcus watched them work with professional efficiency, their white robes a stark contrast to the destruction around them. He was grateful to see that most of his fellow guards had survived the battle, though many bore wounds that would take weeks to heal. The sirens from the palace had finally stopped wailing, replaced by the normal sounds of a castle preparing for a new day. Marcus could hear servants moving about inside, probably cleaning up damage and assessing what needed to be repaired. The royal family would be emerging from their safe chambers soon, eager to learn what had happened during the night. Captain Reynolds was giving orders to groups of guards, organizing the cleanup effort and making sure the palace remained secure. Despite fighting all night, the gray-haired captain showed no signs of fatigue. His experience and leadership had been crucial in defeating the attackers, and Marcus felt honored to serve under such a man. A young page approached Marcus with a message written on fine parchment. "The king requests your immediate presence in the throne room," the boy said nervously. Marcus had never been summoned to meet the king personally, and he felt both excited and terrified by the prospect. Marcus looked down at his armor, which was dented, scratched, and stained with blood from the battle. This was hardly appropriate attire for meeting royalty, but there was no time to change. He quickly wiped his sword clean and slid it back into its sheath, then followed the page through the palace corridors. The throne room was magnificent, with high ceilings decorated with gold and silver, tapestries showing the history of the kingdom, and tall windows that let in the early morning sunlight. Marcus had glimpsed this room before during ceremonies, but he had never been inside it as anything more than a distant observer. King Edmund sat on his ancient throne, a crown of simple gold resting on his graying hair. Despite being in his 50s, the king looked strong and alert, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Beside him stood the queen, elegant in her mourning dress, and their teenage son Prince William, who would someday inherit the throne. "Approach. Guard Marcus," the king said in a voice that carried easily across the large room. Marcus walked forward and knelt before the throne as he had been taught during his training. His heart was beating fast, but he kept his face calm and respectful. "Rise," King Edmund commanded. "We have heard remarkable reports of your courage during last night's attack. Captain Reynolds tells us that you were the first to spot the danger, that you fought with exceptional skill, and that you personally defeated the enemy leader in single combat." Marcus stood up but kept his eyes focused on a point just over the king's shoulder, as was proper protocol. "I only did my duty, Your Majesty," he replied. "Any guard would have done the same in my position." The king smiled slightly at this response. "Modesty is a virtue, young man, but false modesty is not. You showed exceptional courage and skill last night, and such service deserves recognition." He gestured to a court official who stepped forward carrying a small wooden box. "For your bravery in defending the palace and protecting the royal family," King Edmund announced formally, "we hereby award you the Silver Star of Valor, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed upon a guardian of the realm." The court official opened the box to reveal a beautiful silver medallion on a blue ribbon. Marcus felt overwhelmed as the medal was placed around his neck. The Silver Star of Valor was legendary among the guards. Only a few dozen had been awarded in the entire history of the kingdom. His father would have been incredibly proud to see this moment. But the king was not finished. "We also promote you to the rank of senior guard, with all the responsibilities and privileges that entails," he continued. "Captain Reynolds has recommended you for advanced training with the Shadow Guard, should you choose to accept this honor." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. The Shadow Guard was the elite of the elite, and he had never imagined he might be invited to join their ranks. "I am deeply honored, Your Majesty," he managed to say. "I accept both the promotion and the training opportunity with gratitude." Prince William stepped forward then, his young face serious but friendly. "Guard Marcus," he said, "I wanted to personally thank you for keeping my family safe last night. Because of your courage, I will someday be able to inherit a kingdom that is still free and independent." Marcus bowed deeply to the prince. "It was my privilege to serve, Your Highness," he replied. "I hope I will continue to be worthy of your trust in the years to come." The queen spoke next, her voice warm and motherly. "Your parents should be very proud of the man you have become," she said kindly. "We will be sending word to your village about your heroic actions and your promotion." As Marcus left the throne room, his head was spinning with everything that had happened. In one night, he had gone from being a simple guard to being a decorated hero marked for elite training. But he also remembered the dying words of the enemy leader, and he knew that greater challenges lay ahead. Captain Reynolds was waiting for him outside the throne room. "Congratulations, Senior Guard Marcus," he said with a rare smile. "Your Shadow Guard training begins next week. I think you'll find it quite different from anything you've experienced so far." Marcus touched the silver star hanging around his neck and looked out through a window at the plaza where workers were already beginning repairs. The attack had been defeated and the kingdom was safe for now. But Marcus understood that this was just the beginning of his real journey as a guardian of the realm. The peaceful life he had known was over, but in its place was something far more important: a chance to serve at the highest levels and to face whatever threats might come against the kingdom he loved. Marcus smiled as he realized that he was no longer just a guard standing at his post, but a true protector of everything he held dear.